let's bring in Ben Shapiro, editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire, syndicated columnist, host of the Ben Shapiro Show. Ben, are you shocked we got to this point?
Not at all. I mean, I think that this has been going on for at least a couple of years here. It started on college campuses, obviously. We've seen it at rallies during the last election cycle. Remember, there was a rally for President Trump in Chicago that was shut down due to tactics like this. I don't find any of this particularly shocking. I guess I'm just shocked by how much of the mainstream left has decided to endorse it. I mean, there have been Democratic leaders who have said that these sort of tactics are unacceptable, but I'm not sure they're not being outflanked by their radical base at this point.
Has this ever happened to you? What happened to all of these individuals? Or Pam Bondi? My gosh, they got up in her face. I know that there have been protesters when you speak at schools, but has anything like that happened when you're out at a restaurant or a movie theater?
No, thank God. This is one of the benefits of keeping kosher. When I go to kosher restaurants, I'm generally pretty popular. So,
what about this? You know, there are a number of major newspapers today, the New York Daily News, the LA Times. They're talking about how this could backfire. LA Times writes, resist too far. Pelosi tries to tamp down progressives' public shaming of Trump officials. And she's not the only one. Chuck Schumer essentially came out and said, hey, stop.
Yeah, and the problem, though, is that you have people like Simone Sanders on CNN yesterday saying that it is a part of white privilege to call for civility, and she's not the only one saying that. You saw John Legend yesterday do the same thing on Twitter, where he suggested that calling people out in public places, destroying their ability to have dinner, standing outside their home, and this is all stuff that should happen if you disagree with the policy enough. And this is why I say I think that, you know, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer may be representing something good on this particular issue, but their base is not particularly interested in what they have to say, or at least large segments of the base.
Hey, Ben, you know what my worry is? My worry is the natural response is to do the same thing back to the other side. And then Republican activists are going to be disturbing other people in other restaurants and at movie theaters and at the park. And then the families are more than likely involved because that's what they do. They find out where you live. I don't want Republicans to mimic this. I mean, isolate these incidents and stop them. I think it's got to be a huge national awareness, not a response.
I totally agree with that. And I think this is one of the big problems that we have in our politics right now is everybody assumes that they're being victimized and therefore their reaction is okay. So I wouldn't be surprised if some folks on the right see this as permission to go do this to folks on the left. I think that a lot of folks on the left see this whole tactic as a response to President Trump being rude at rallies and such. And the problem is, once you see yourself as a victim, I mean, psychological studies are pretty clear on this. Once you see yourself as a victim, you're far more likely to see yourself as someone who's capable of victimizing others. It's okay to victimize others because you're just responding. But once you feel like you're responding, it gives you a lot more moral credence to go out and do something bad to somebody else. I think that's what the left is feeling today.
You talked a little bit about Hollywood. The Hollywood director and the producer, Judd Apatow, he tweeted this out. He's talking about the president. He says he's a Nazi. He wants no judicial process. He kidnapped children and commits acts of violence for political gain and to support his racist views. He admires violent dictators. Trump is a Nazi. The debate is over. Soon we will have proof he is a Nazi supported by the Russians. Your reaction?
I mean, delusional nonsense. Read a damn book. But unfortunately, in Los Angeles, this has sort of become the way people think, because it's a water cooler town and everybody thinks the same way. You can say crazy things like Trump is a Nazi and get away with it. If Trump were a Nazi, does Judd Apatow really think that he'd be able to go on Twitter and say stuff like this? The Nazis were not famous for their tolerance of dissent, particularly in this sort of manner.
All right, let's shift gears. Let's take, in this next soundbite, listen up, Ben. Here is former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. Once again, she is comparing the current president to the guy in Turkey who just won another term. Watch.
Populists can stay in power by mobilizing a fervent base. Louise mentioned my personal experience with winning 3 million more votes, but still losing. And we will leave discussions of the American Electoral College for another day. Monk concludes by saying, Turkey also shows that political and intellectual elites, both inside the country and around the world, persistently underestimate the threat which these kinds of leaders pose to the survival of democratic institutions.
So, Ben, she would be president of the United States today if it wasn't for that pesky Electoral College.
Yeah, well, I like that she only is angry at the Electoral College now, right? After you lose, it's a convenient time to get angry at the Electoral College. My favorite part of that, though, is where she's suddenly comparing Trump to Erdogan. Well, she was Secretary of State, and when she was Secretary of State, she was actually pretty warm with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's a dictator over in Turkey. In March 2009, she actually was talking about Turkey, and somebody asked her about human rights violations and the attempt to quash dissidents, and she suggested that Erdogan was partially justified because who likes being criticized by the press? So just like typical Hillary Clinton, when she was in office, she was very friendly toward all of the world's worst dictators. As soon as she leaves, suddenly President Trump is just like those dictators who she was massaging until 5 seconds ago.
And Ben, the whole thing about Erdogan, he jailed his opponent. The opponent had to campaign from prison. Does President Trump say that did he win because now Hillary Clinton was locked up?
No, he said lock her up, but she wasn't actually, it turns out. So.
Good point. All right. Ben, thank you very much for joining us today. Check out his wildly successful Ben Shapiro podcast.
Thank you, Ben.
Very rare that you find somebody who's an aggressor who doesn't claim that they were acting in some sort of vague sense of self-defense. Well, this is what Democrats are doing now. Democrats are basically suggesting that Trump started all of this. And Trump, meanwhile, is suggesting that Democrats started all of this. Now, I think the Democrats got uncivil long before Republicans did. I think they were deeply uncivil during the Bush administration when they were calling Bush Hitler. I think that President Obama was uncivil in the way that he was fomenting riots in places like Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland. But does that mean that we have an excuse for exacerbating the incivility? I don't think so, because the bottom line is that we can now have this reactionary back and forth of incivility across the political aisle as long as we want to do it. I just don't think that's going to make the country better in any way. But my argument is likely to lose, because I'm saying that we should take a moral high ground here, that we should take a stand in favor of civility, that even if somebody is attempting to protest you and destroy you by going into a restaurant and yelling at you, that this is not an excuse for you to do the same thing to people on the other side of the aisle. I understand that's an unpopular perspective right now, and this is how you have entire political parties that are captured by a base. So while you have Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi condemning Maxine Waters, I really think that Maxine Waters is the future of the Democratic Party, in just the same way that you saw Democrats during 2008, 2012, 2016, suggesting that Bernie Sanders was too radical, and then Bernie Sanders took over the entire base. I think the same thing holds true here. Maxine Waters is channeling the most extreme side of the Democratic base, and that extreme side of the Democratic base has a lot of emotion behind it. And even people in the mainstream of the Democratic Party, they may disagree with the tactics, but they agree with the sentiment. And so I think Maxine Waters, in the end, is probably going to win this one in the long run. I don't think a return to civility is in the cards anytime soon. Here's Maxine Waters, who is expressing exactly what I'm talking about, blaming Trump for her own nasty and evil actions here.
I don't know why the president chose to stretch that out and try to imply that I was causing harm. As a matter of fact, the president calls for more violence than anybody else. But let's not talk about that.
Okay, so Maxine Waters, again, saying that it's totally okay for her to call for violence or mob action because Trump, she thinks, called for violence or mob action. Then President Trump has responded basically in kind, right? President Trump has suggested that there would be consequences for what Maxine Waters had to say, that there would be backlash. None of this is good stuff. And as I say, I think Maxine Waters represents a serious portion of the Democratic base and the most passionate portion of the Democratic base, and the part of the Democratic base that a lot of these politicians like Schumer and Pelosi eventually will have to bow to. So, for example, John Legend, who is, I think, more representative of the base in many ways than Nancy Pelosi, he tweeted out, "Let's make a deal with the Trump administration. Reunite all these families immediately, and you can go out to eat wherever the bleep you want. In other words, do what we want, or we're going to use tactics of intimidation." And John Legend is, of course, a very popular figure. Simone Sanders on CNN, she said yesterday that all these people who are talking about civility, including Nancy Pelosi, including people like Chuck Schumer, the only reason they're talking about civility is because civility is just another instance of white privilege.
There is something to be said about that the folks calling for civility might need to check their privilege. And so where is the civility in the press briefing room, Jake? Where is the civility at the border for these children? And so this conversation about civility is completely one-sided and skewed.
How is it one-sided and skewed? Going into restaurants and shouting people out of restaurants, going to people's homes and protesting outside their homes. How exactly is that skewed? Why is that an element of white privilege? It seems to me that of all the people in the United States who shouldn't like mob action, black folks should be high on that list, considering how mob action resulted in tremendous suffering for black people for literally a century and a half in this country. Like that makes no sense to me. Like the worst instances of mob action in this country's history have been actions that were taken in the Jim Crow South during the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. And yet Simone Sanders says that to oppose mob action is some sort of white privilege. I don't see that at all. I don't understand how that works. Ashley Nicole Black, she tweeted something out similarly. This is tweet 15. This is a writer, I believe, for Jimmy Kimmel. And she tweeted, oh, hello, I didn't see you there. Civility is a tool of white supremacy. Okay, cool. Bye. Which is a weird tweet. She tweeted that out. She's Samantha B. writer, rather. Civility is a tool of white supremacy? No, civility is a tool of having a